The Congressional Budget Office just released its new projection on where the United States will be with its income, its expenses, and its debt over the coming decades. It anticipates it will add $19 trillion in debt over just the next 10 years. But that's not even the scariest part. If we take a look at their report, we can see that they project by the year 2050 for the total debt to GDP to exceed 200%. Many economists view 120% as the point of no return. If you pass that point, you're basically a snake eating itself by the tail, and there is no amount of money you can extract from the economy in order to save the debt issue, solve the debt issue, while at the same time allowing the economy to continue to thrive and grow that allows you to continue to try and pay off that debt. Once you reach 120, basically you're destined to default. The CBO projects that over the next few years, the deficit will get worse until in 2033, it reaches 2.7 trillion. And this is anticipating no crisis, no war, no economic crisis. And meanwhile, we look at the biggest deficit we've had so far. For reference, in 2020, the deficit slightly exceeded 3.1 trillion. Again, these terrible numbers are all assuming everything stays the same from here on out. The current projections for debt and deficits are what the economy would look like in 10 years if laws governing taxes and spending generally remain unchanged. And at the rate that our government flip-flops with laws about taxes and regulations and supporting the economy and trying to crush the economy, the Federal Reserve lowering rates, raising rates, pretty much the safest bet you can make is that it will not stay the same. Now, it is pretty surprising to me that this graph comes directly from the Congressional Budget Office. I mean, they're not trying to hide anything here. The numbers that they're presenting in this projection are bad numbers. They do not paint a rosy picture of the future. It is an unsustainable track that we are on, looking at how much money the government spends, how much money the government owes in interest, how much money the government has to borrow to support its spending, and how much money the economy actually has to give to the government so that the government can continue to waste it. It is not a pretty picture. Yet at the same time, this is all just a projection. Everything before this line is real numbers. And we have been here before. Not exactly the same situation, but in terms of debt to GDP, in terms of inflation numbers, in terms of a couple other metrics, we are very similar right now as the nation was in the 40s. So how did we get out of it last time? With approaching almost this 120% debt to GDP, how in the world did we escape that? Well, there are two very large reasons for this, and they both contributed to a massive explosion in productive output. One of them was adding women to the workforce, and one of them was adding more men to the workforce from the military. For decades, especially prior to the 60s during wartime, women had to enter the workforce, and the workforce got used to it. Over the span of a few decades, we almost doubled our workforce as a percentage of our population simply because most women started working. This is something that massively increases productive output. We went from most households having one person in the workforce to most households having two people in the workforce. Obviously, that's going to increase your productive output. When you increase your productive output, that's going to increase your GDP. That's going to help out your debt to GDP ratio, even if you don't do anything to address the debt. The second thing is everybody coming home from the war and going back into the workforce. Again, a lot of economists did not expect it to happen this way. A lot of economists said we'd be entering into a massive decades-long recession as a result of the war ending and a bunch of people coming home to, no jobs to do. Well, guess what? That's not the way it works. When you add people to the workforce, it actually increases productivity and wealth. It doesn't decrease it. More people making more stuff for everybody helps everybody out. That doesn't make things worse. So given those two major factors, and obviously there are a lot of other factors at play, but Given those two factors, which in my opinion are some of the largest, do we have the ability to replicate this? Well, first of all, right now, most women who can work already do. We can see here that ever since about the year 2000, we've basically been maxed out on the number of women in the workforce. What about military though? As of 2017, there are about 142 million US civilians employed versus about 1.3 million active duty. Now, percentage-wise, that's not huge, but take a look at the professions. In the military, we have professions such as mechanics and repairers, massively. The blue lines represent military personnel and the orange lines represent civilian employment. We can see that mechanics, repairers, engineers, science, technical, transportation, protective service, these are all overly represented in the military. A decline in global military involvement and bringing home the troops and reducing the size of the military and all of these very, very highly skilled employees being added back into the private workforce to create wealth instead of being funded by extracting wealth. This would be at least a small improvement. Obviously, that wouldn't solve everything, so what about all of the people employed by the government in general? Right now, the US government is a massive employer in the country. And when I say people are employed by the government, I mean that people are getting paid because there's an entity that takes money from you to pay them. To put this in perspective, Walmart employs about 1.5 million workers, but the federal government employs over 9 million workers. It makes up over 6% of total employment in the US. Do we think that there might be a little bit of an opportunity to reduce the size of the government? Number one, just like the military, this would add a massive number of productive workers back into the workforce, where instead of being paid by extracting wealth from society, they would get paid to create wealth for society. But that's not it. But many people right now are screaming inside of their minds thinking that's preposterous. You can't possibly expect the United States government to just fire and let go of employees. Well, how about we don't look at some pie in the sky ideal of an extremely small United States government. Let's just look at, I don't know, 5 years ago? Take a look at the current federal surplus or deficit. We have run deficits pretty much every year in our existence, with 2022 hitting just under 1.4 trillion. That deficit came from a total spending of about $6.3 trillion. So the government spent $6.3 trillion, but they only received about $4.9 trillion from taxes, which meant they had to borrow $1.4 trillion to make up the difference. So is it unreasonable to expect that the government could spend $1.4 trillion less than they did last year? Personally, I don't think it's unreasonable considering that's exactly what they spent in 2018. In 2022, receiving about $4.9 trillion in income, they would have zero deficit. In fact, they'd have a surplus if they simply returned to the 2018 budget. That doesn't require ending the military. That doesn't require ending Social Security. That doesn't require ending Medicare. That doesn't require firing half of government employees. That doesn't require anything ridiculous or radical. It simply means go back 4 years and spend the same amount of money you did then. And clearly it's not an income problem, seeing that United States government income has risen pretty much every single year. But regardless of how much they extract from your pocket, they will never stop spending more. That is, until this becomes an issue. And the reason why that's going to become an issue very soon here has nothing to do with any of those expenses that I just mentioned, which are controllable. Right now, if we break down where the government spends its money on, it spends a little under $500 billion a year on interest on its debt. But a lot of that debt was borrowed when interest rates were much lower than what they are right now, which means that as they start to pay off that debt by borrowing more, the amount they have to spend on interest will move up the chain. Now, they could absolutely dull the impact of this problem if they just ran balanced budgets, which again, they could do by returning to a budget that they used 5 years ago. There's no need to spend $1.5, $2 trillion more this year than we did in 2018, especially because every year we run these trillion and $2 trillion deficits, we make the future interest problem even worse. In fact, we may already be past the point of no return. Now, if you would like to know how I invest so that I don't have to worry about inflation, deflation, these budget deficits, debt defaults by the government, you need to bulletproof your portfolio. Get my portfolio allocation mastery course linked in the description below. There is one more wildcard, fortunately, that could help us escape this problem unscathed, and that would be a massive increase in productive output. That's the goal here, because we can't really do much to persuade the government to reduce its expenses and fix the debt issue. So the only other thing that could happen is we can massively increase productive output. The way we did this back in the 40s was by massively increasing the number of people that were in the workforce. There are two ways we could do that today. Obviously, most Americans who can work are already working, but one, we very well may soon see a massive increase in our workforce through artificially intelligent robots. That would be a huge benefit, massive increase to productive output. Is that probable anytime soon? In my opinion, no. Is it possible though? Yeah. The second way we could massively increase our productive output is through immigration. As deglobalization continues, we have many parts of the world getting much worse to live in. That means that even if America gets worse, it just gets worse at a slower pace than the rest of the world, it still will maintain its place as being one of the most attractive places in the world for immigrants to move to. If we do continue to have a massive influx of immigrants, that is an increase in our productive workforce. That's a good thing. That increases wealth. That's not a bad thing. That is something we desperately need, as our birth rate has been below replacement levels since the 70s. And if we have a collapse in the population because no more immigrants are coming here, that will make problems just that much worse. So it's really that simple. Maintain a balanced budget by returning to a budget that we used just 5 years ago. And number two, maintain a regulatory atmosphere and a freedom atmosphere and a welcoming culture that allows people from around the world to continue to want to be a part of our nation. But I guess sometimes some things are easier said than done. As always, really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.